Right now in Sudan, anarchist comrades are organizing in the middle of a war, repression, and displacement. The anarchist group in Sudan is building mutual aid, grassroots committees, and political education for survival and liberation. And they need our support. You can stand with them by making a one-time donation, holding your own fundraiser and sending the funds to the Open Collective, Support Sudanese Comrades, link in bio, or become a monthly supporter at that same Open Collective link. Every contribution strengthens their ability to keep resisting and caring for their people. Solidarity means action. Tap the link in our bio or in the show notes and support the anarchist group in Sudan today.
Hey listeners, The Dugout is all about sharing Black radical history and ideas to spark learning and action. If you've gained anything from these conversations, especially if you think we're cute, consider supporting us on Patreon. Your support helps us cover production costs, bringing on our amazing guests, getting Jordan all cozy before they smoke their little doobie before each episode, and beyond. Plus, you'll get early access to interviews and exclusive reading episodes. Head to patreon.com/thedugoutpod to join us and keep this work going.
Howdy, and welcome to The Dugout. First question is, who are you? And a question we like to just ask everyone who's on is, what was a young Rachel like? What was a young you like?
My name's Rachel Ramlan Moy. I'm an internationalist militant fighting here in the incredibly beautiful this morning Freechen Hills of Western Burma. Yeah, and as to your question, what was a young Rachel like? You can say anti-authoritarian. Very much a rebellious streak always, and quite a long history, at least what I would view at the time, dismantling structures of oppression, like bedtime. If y'all don't mind, on that exact topic, I have a poem that I was hoping to read that kind of perfectly comes into that. I'm doing a quick re-recording of this poem just because of some technical difficulties yesterday. I'm recording it looking out at some of the most incredible mountains I've ever seen in all the world. I'm a short walk from the guerrilla camp. It's sunrise. I can see the clouds hanging low in the valley, other clouds sort of cascading down some of the ridges of these forested mountains. And on the distant peaks, the first glimmers of sunrise are just starting to touch. We're starting to see the slightest orange glow at the top. I'm reminded of how incredibly lucky I am, how privileged I am to be part of this revolution. I was a child in the valleys of a mountain named a woman. She took her name from ancient days, long before the logger's blades shaved her bare. In seaward air I ran through grass so tall that I could lie small, hidden from the open sky that beckoned, terrifying. Take a look around at all the holes we've dug, zigzagged for grenade blasts, but facing west toward the river. Whose river? Ours, of course, but ours in course of time means more and less. In old unrest we are obsessed with questions no one needs to answer. Whose river? We belong to the mountains, not the other way around. Carving up the land in slices, over it all the moon she rises, casts her light upon a burial ground. Oh, how many states and armies share a mother. Name the other, name new foes, distract from those, too grand, too old to be opposed. A war upon the mothers. Strike us down if we remind you of the mountain you belong to, of the families you've left behind. Tell me, can you see the river's mark upon my body? I am carved up like the mountain. Is that why you felt entitled all to stake dubious claim? The chance to name each peak, every wrinkle. Oh, I know to you they're all the same. Insane, I once would call it. Every man a little state, every mountain made a slave. Every child only another way to rule her. Build a school, but name it after some new god. A cancer, welcomed once it proved a weapon. Welcome once it proved a tool to lead us further from the answers. Tell me, if you can, who will rule over your aftermath? This poem is about a lot of things. Most significantly, it's about the tensions that we always face as part of revolutionary struggle. between revolution, between uprising, and between war and its impulses, especially some of its most masculine impulses. And it sort of was a way of reckoning with the visions I had of anti-authoritarian struggle as a child and as a young person, the realities of what that struggle requires of us in the present world, especially as women.
I would say I always had a very strong internalized and kind of very emotional anti-authoritarian streak, and this aversion to structures of power and to especially like hierarchies that I saw as unjust. But of course, that's an impulse that a lot of us share and that has to be developed further into real struggle.
What does being an internationalist mean to you, and how has that influenced your life?
So, internationalism obviously has a very long history on the left. It's a very important term to us. We use this term quite intentionally. We're not foreign fighters, we're not international volunteers or something. We are here as internationalists. And of course, there's a range of different histories that different people, especially in the West, of different political backgrounds, like to look to and lean on for their understanding of internationalism. There's long histories of Marxist or Maoist internationalism. There's very long histories of anarchist internationalism. There's very long histories of internationalism of almost any kind of position on the left that one can take. There has been internationalism. And something that's, at least to me, really important, because of course I'm not here speaking like on behalf of our organization. I'm here speaking as myself. The thing that is most important to us is internationalism as its own position. Within the AIF, there are a wide range of different political tendencies. Of course, all left tendencies, we can say, but quite a diversity there. And the most important thing that I think we all share is this real commitment to the idea of internationalism as something that can stand on its own and as a model for a new and different left. Certainly for me, I view the AIF as part of this new international, as part of this new wave of internationalism that we can see examples of in everything from Chiapas to Kurdistan to the international struggle for a free Palestine to places like Western Sahara to, of course, even locally to this region in Southeast Asia. We see the recent incredible uprising in Nepal and the revolution in Nepal, or we see the uprisings in Indonesia. There is a real new wave of internationalist struggle and of especially anti-fascist and anti-dictatorship struggle. I see my place in this international struggle as the most important part of my politics.
A bit of a context question, but for folks that are listening and maybe newer to learning about the work that's happening, could you talk a little bit about the context that led to the AIF and lay some of the groundwork for people that might be newer to it or the struggle?
I won't give an entire exhaustive history of revolutionary struggle in Burma. There's literally hundreds of years of history there. Of course, also my comrade Azad has given some very good interviews also in the past that get quite deep into this. Burma, as kind of a collection of peoples, has for a very long time been oppressed and been colonized by a long series of different structures, by a long series of different rulers. Especially when you're talking about the oppression of certain ethnic groups, this can go all the way back to the time of the Burmese kings. And then, of course, we can point very directly to the colonial legacy of the British here. And, of course, also to the Japanese, to other nation states coming here to do either colonialism or just outright war on the peoples of Burma. And then, of course, in the time since, especially the end of British rule in Burma, since the end of direct British colonial rule, we've seen an ongoing period of post-colonial and neo-colonial exploitation here. The various ruling powers that have held power in Burma over the past few decades, like better part of a century since the end of British rule, have, at least in my perspective, borrowed a great deal from and learned and inherited a great deal from that long legacy of colonialism. And so really, for example, here in the Chin Hills where we fight, we see the centralized Burmese Bamar nationalist dictatorship as yet another colonizing power and yet another invader in this area. This is largely the case in many of the more remote, more ungovernable, we can say, regions of Burma. And of course, over the past decades, since the end of British rule, there have been a long series of different types of uprising and different types of revolutionary struggle, separatist struggle. These have taken a couple of different forms. We've seen, of course, the rise and the development of what we call ethnic armed organizations or ethnic revolutionary organizations, depending on which particular context you're talking about them, which have a long and storied history of armed struggle against the Burmese nationalist central government. We also have quite a long history of what we in the West would see as more politically legible, in some cases leftist movements, in some cases kind of like anti-dictatorship or anti-authoritarian movements that have taken various forms. We can look, of course, for one example, to the revolutionary movement of 1988, which brings a lot of inspiration to the present struggle here in Myanmar for a lot of local people. The shape of the government, the shape of the nation state that has been oppressing the Burmese people for so long has taken many forms over these decades. Some of them, by name ostensibly socialist, some of them more directly outright fascist, some of them kind of their own secret third thing. There's a wide diversity of shapes that this broadly dictatorial government has taken over the past decades, but all of them have carried on this ongoing project of Burmese Bamar Buddhist nationalism and of oppression of all of the other ethnic groups within what's at least called on a map Burma or Myanmar. This oppression has not only been direct oppression of these other ethnic groups. Of course, in any fascist, especially any ethno-nationalist project, we're of course in the West familiar with the idea of the boomerang, the colonial boomerang. The same thing happens on a more local scale with the kind of more internal colonies within Burma. The methods that are used to police and to oppress all of the other non-Bamar ethnic groups in Burma have, of course, also been turned back against student movements, been turned back against leftist movements, been turned back against any pro-democracy movement that tries to rise here. We can point to this most recent revolution that we're part of, which we refer to as the Spring Revolution. This revolution began in 2021 after the results of the historic 2020 election. This was the culmination of an ongoing project of kind of liberalization and turning toward a more democratic, or a more, at least what kind of Western electoralists would call democratic, model of Myanmar. This looked like the expansion of elections. This looked like the introduction of some kind of negotiation processes to sort of walk down and ease back from the absolute power of the centralized military dictatorship that had for so long ruled Myanmar. The result of this, of course, was that the NLD, the National League for Democracy, which was, of course, the party kind of figureheaded by Aung San Suu Kyi, won an incredible landslide victory in 2020, which the ruling Tatmadaw military viewed as an unacceptable threat to their position of power. As a result of this, in 2021, they staged a coup and overthrew, brought down this democratically elected government, did not let them actually come to power and fulfill these kind of promises of democracy. And so we saw the beginning of the Spring Revolution. This coup, of course, resulted in what we now know as the Spring Revolution, the revolution in which we participate. This began with peaceful protests and marches, really turning toward and looking toward the international community, whether it was the UN or ASEAN or other bodies of nation states. This movement really was looking toward those bodies to hold the Tatmadaw accountable and to not allow them to reverse this process of democratization. As a result of this internal colony and the boomerang effect that we were talking about earlier, we really saw this immense crackdown, not only in the regions controlled by different ethnic groups and the regions of different ethnic groups in the kind of mountainous periphery of Burma, but also directly in the more central and more strategically critical to the Tatmadaw Burmese cities. In both of these places, we saw immense crackdowns. Even from the very beginning of this wave of protest, we saw lethal force being used against protesters on a massive scale. As a result of this, the protest movement necessarily became armed struggle. We can look, of course, to places like Mindat as places where we saw early examples of very high levels of armed struggle, not just from existing ethnic armed organizations. In fact, some of these groups were quite slow to respond to the revolution. Broadly, what we saw in the beginning was protesters fighting the police, fighting for their freedom, fighting real military battles and winning, taking checkpoints, taking territory, using homemade air rifles and slingshots and black powder single shot hunting rifles that they had from like family in the villages. Even in this very early stage with very limited access to equipment, access to the materiel of armed struggle, they waged very effective guerrilla and urban guerrilla struggle against the state. This evolved very quickly with the formation of the PDFs, the kind of ties that were built between different PDFs and ethnic armed organizations. Lots of people kind of going to the mountains, going to the hills to be trained, to gain weapons, and to learn how to wage struggle. Quite quickly, this escalated into the armed revolution that we see today, this real high level of militant and military struggle against the Tatmadaw dictatorship. We kind of, as the AIF entered the picture, was in the Battle of Phalam, or just before the Battle of Phalam, in Chin State, in the Chin Hills. The formation of the AIF came as a result of a process started by internationalists who were already here, already fighting, already participating in the revolution on both a kind of political and militant basis. In the lead up to this battle, it was decided that this presence should be both formalized and expanded. With that, the AIF was formed and more people arrived in the country to participate in that battle. Yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question of the background of the revolution, where in the revolution we arrived.
By the time this comes out, you might have a new zine coming out. Is there a title for that piece?
The current working title, at least, is Lessons from the Hills.
And in that, it's beautifully written, and you write about, quote, fighting as a woman in a men's revolution will not further our cause, and stuff of the effect of building women's autonomy in this revolution and how that's played. And I know Azad has talked a bit about some of the intentions that the AIF has brought with like gender parity and trainings and things like that. I'm kind of curious, what has the women's autonomous revolution kind of looked like so far from your point of view? Like, what kind of culture did you come into and are you surrounded by and a part of?
We can give some context there, of course, especially here where we fight in the Chin Hills. There's a long history of successive waves of the bringing of patriarchy to these mountains and to the people of these mountains. This was done, of course, by the British. This was done even all the way back to the time of the Burmese kings, and especially has been done through a process of, we can say, kind of especially American, but broadly Western and capitalist cultural hegemony and intentional processes of cultural export to this place. There is, of course, in any culture, seeds of patriarchy, at least any culture that begins to go down that road, we will find certain seeds of patriarchy everywhere. The shape of patriarchy in these mountains is one that's alarmingly familiar, actually. I expected to come here and face really strange and different forms of patriarchy and of women's struggle. And actually, the ways in which the patriarchy is strange are almost refreshing. There are small ways, but those are broadly the least challenging to struggle against. One of the most interesting things here is how much the most significant forces of patriarchy are things that were brought to these mountains by Westerners and especially by Americans. We, of course, have to fight patriarchy on two fronts in this revolution. There is the very immediate front of the rapist and feminicidal enemy, the Tatmadaw, the SAC, Sakasa, Tatmadaw dictatorship junta. It has many names, especially in Western reporting. We call it the Tatmadaw or the SAC most frequently. This is a profoundly anti-woman political project. In the same way that it is a ethnic nationalist project, and it uses the division and it uses the elevating of certain ethnicities and certain kind of nations above others as its tool of maintaining and expanding its power. It also uses one of the oldest forms of colonization humanity has ever unfortunately developed, which is, of course, the domination of women by men. This takes many forms. Obviously, there is a lot of nuance to patriarchy. Fundamentally, this is the direction, the axis that we see this take. So, or at least for me, in my organizing, the primary focus here is women's struggle and women's revolution. We can look for examples to many different movements and see ways that women have participated in various leftist revolutionary struggles for a very long time, whether in Cuba or the Sandinistas, or we can look even to the PFLP. We can look to a wide range of different revolutionary struggles and see women in very significant roles of fighting in these struggles, of taking different positions, even of leadership sometimes in these struggles. But ultimately, when I look to examples elsewhere in the world, I can kind of categorize into two groupings the results of these struggles for women. There is the struggles in which women participate in a men's revolution, and whether the revolution succeeds or fails, they end up back in a position of subservience once the cracks of struggle begin to close again. And once we begin to get this wave of the seeking of normalcy by people after a period of uprising. One of the first things to go is gains made by women in the cracks of revolution. As these cracks close, very frequently women are crushed back within them. The other example that I look to is groups and projects and revolutionary struggles in which women's revolution, and a revolution driven by this need to destroy patriarchal oppression as a root origin point of all oppression, are really prioritized. Struggles in which women are taking the forefront of struggle in order to dismantle this root oppression as a part of the process of dismantling all oppression that they are faced with. And in these cases, where real women's autonomous struggle and women's revolution are built as a core priority of the struggle, and especially as the women's priority, these are the revolutions where we see real lasting gains for women. And so that's sort of the view that I take here, and this is the lens through which we work towards women's struggle and women's revolution in Myanmar, and especially in the Chin Hills. To that end, obviously, you've talked a little bit about the ways that Azad has previously discussed, like our efforts of bringing gender parity to our training and other approaches. These are all important. The idea that every training should have equal balance of men and women in it, equal gender balance, equal representation of different genders, and equal representation of different ways that people are impacted by patriarchy and struggling against patriarchy is extremely important. But one of the things I realized quite quickly here is that this too is not quite enough. If all we do is train an equal number of men and women, then ultimately, without further work, the men will go on to use those skills and fight, and the women, unless they are uplifted in other ways, will mostly still not be able to actually be in the front of the revolution and really pushing the revolution onward. And so instead, the focus for me, now that we have this foundation of gender parity in all of our works, is autonomy, is the building of these autonomous power structures and the building of this real political development with all of the women that I'm working with, to move towards not only a position in which women are being kind of equally provided opportunities, but to actually create the structures and the processes and the foundation by which the women here can free themselves and can elevate their struggle for not just a free territory of the Chin Hills, but a real women's revolution, and a revolution in which they are dismantling the root structures of oppression, like patriarchy.
In terms of going beyond like just representation in these kind of training settings and moving towards autonomy and power structures and political development. I'm really interested in like the bringing the patriarchy to the hills. And I guess maybe my question is about how do y'all work through that tension, to your point about certain forms of patriarchal expressions being brought in by Westerners? How have you moved through those conversations, or is there tension around trying to make things more equal and building these structures of autonomy? But then I'm also thinking about camaraderie and doing this work together and how that's like a form of building trust. So I guess I'm just curious about navigating maybe what I imagine could be some of that tension.
When we talk about coming to these mountains for revolutionary struggle and for ultimately a political project, we have to talk about especially the tensions, not just of gender here, but of course of this history of colonization, of the missionary history here, of the very wide range of ways that Westerners have already come here in, we can say broadly, unhelpful. And especially the ways that this impacts sort of the lenses through which we as Westerners will be viewed in these mountains. I can give a personal example, actually. I've found that for me as a woman here, working on this very important kind of revolutionary political work of women's struggle, there is, in every interaction I experience, there is a dual tension. There is the tension in whoever I'm speaking to towards taking me less seriously on account of my being a woman. That is the case everywhere in the world, more or less. Here is kind of no different, and in some ways, here is like notably so. At the same time, there is also the tendency towards, by default, seeing me as a foreigner, especially a white foreigner, as someone to be taken extra seriously and listened to and respected and saluted and all of these things. And so there's always a challenging balance of how do I make sure that I'm taken seriously as a woman, but not deferred to as a white Westerner. And this is one of the ongoing and significant challenges of internationalist work, especially internationalist work in a place that doesn't have a long and storied history of internationalist struggle the way that somewhere like Kurdistan or somewhere like Chiapas might have. There isn't already a baseline normalization of politicized internationalist revolutionary struggle here and revolutionary camaraderie and solidarity here. And so in many ways we have to kind of build those foundations and build the norms ourselves as some of the first people, at least in this particular part of this struggle, doing that here. There's of course also the fact that women's struggle here, women's revolution here, will not look like women's struggle in the USA or women's struggle in any other place where we might take inspiration from. This is a unique and specific cultural context, and so our approach and our direction and our solutions to women's struggle have to be very localized in this way. For this reason, one of the most important parts of my approach to organizing here is not about teaching the women here how they should be living or how they should be free. It's about teaching the women that I work with here the tools by which to free themselves, the tools by which to come to decisions together, the tools by which to apply those decisions and through autonomous action actually make change based on the decisions they collectively make. It is not about showing up and saying, this is how we should be free, this is how we will achieve it, do it with me. It's about working collectively with other women and sharing the tools that I know, sharing the tools that I've learned of autonomous women's struggle and autonomous women's revolution as tools that can be used by local collective structures of women to achieve their own goals of liberation, whatever those may be.
What kind of structures or organizing spaces are women building for themselves or are locally exist or think that be bolstering around? What did they come together for?
It varies from group to group. I, of course, have only personally seen a small sliver of the revolution in Myanmar. These particular mountains, even this particular part of these mountains. There are many mountains here, even that I have not seen. And especially when we talk about like the plains regions, I've seen very little, only little small slivers here and there. But of course, we've built very close revolutionary ties, especially through our processes of giving training to lots of local revolutionary groups. I've been able to build really strong political ties and relationships and camaraderie with women from dozens of revolutionary organizations around the country. I can think back, especially one of the most important times of political development for me personally, and also the ways that we as the AIF started to build real bonds of women's solidarity was actually my time in sniper training. It was not as a instructor, it was actually as a student. Learning this particular military skill as part of a independent and autonomous body of women within this training, we were able to come together and really share understanding and this knowledge of all the different ways that we as women are struggling in our different organizations. There are many different currents of women's organizing across these different organizations. This diversity of positions and this diversity of structures of women's organizing in this revolution is very broad. Some organizations in Myanmar have no women in them at all, frankly. Other organizations have women in very elevated positions of leadership, both political leadership, military, in a variety of different ways. Most importantly, there are quite a few organizations that I've worked with in Myanmar that actually have a real position of women's struggle. But I can look to one organization, for example, that I was building very close ties with some of the women from in our sniper training. The bonds of solidarity, and especially among these women, the bonds of queer feminist solidarity that they were forming within this revolutionary army were really incredible to see. They have a real project in this group of kind of shared liberation for women and for queer people, and especially for the overlap between the two. And this was able to really kind of blossom in this microcosm of the autonomous structures within the sniper training that I was joining them in. And I was able to learn a huge amount from them. We can say one of the things that's been really beautiful for me to see is this synthesis and this overlap between the structures of women's revolution and the ability for kind of queer liberation and the freedom of queer people to blossom in and alongside that project. Because ultimately, women's struggle and queer struggle are two axes, or at least kind of two vectors, from which we can push back at the ancient and fundamental and foundational oppression that we receive from patriarchy, and this foundation of oppression of patriarchy on which so much of, if not perhaps all of, state oppression is ultimately built. And so we see the ways in which these different groups coming together, bringing all of their different approaches to women's struggle together, can result in these syntheses of much more significant and rapid political development and growth in political position on how we strategize around and how we talk about and how we understand our approach to dismantling patriarchy.
Hell yeah, that's really awesome to hear. Is there what are like the intentions around political development and education and knowledge sharing?
For us or for like different groups here?
Just like what role or are there any roles or intentions, especially in organizing around women's struggle or just in general around like political development, political education, sharing knowledge? Like is that a staple in life or is that something that you've or like when you do bring it up or things like that, people sharing information? Does it happen in any sort of formal setting, or is it more like informal?
Yeah, for us, around our intentions around it, the first part of the question, it's in everything we do. Our being here as internationalists, part of the way I talked about, we are not here as foreign fighters, we are here as internationalists. Part of that is that every single thing we do here is political. This goes not just for us, it goes, we think, for every person in this revolution. Every single act we take in this struggle is a political act. If we show up here and are preaching our, frankly, quite Western ideas of political development, this is both not effective and also simply not what we want. This wouldn't achieve any of the goals that we would actually like to see, and this wouldn't actually drive the revolution forward in any meaningful way. We also cannot just show up here and say, oh, well, this is their revolution, we're just here to help, or something like this, or almost white deference that we see very commonly in Western leftists. At least to me, I see this as the path to depoliticizing our struggle here, and actually not being here in bonds of solidarity, but simply being here in a military capacity. And this is also not right. The way forward in this shared internationalist revolutionary struggle with our comrades here is that in every single thing we do, whether we are fighting on the front line, getting exploded together, or whether we're in our guerrilla camps in the mountains together, baking bread and sharing technical knowledge with one another, or even just reading or enjoying our time together as revolutionaries. In every single thing we do, big or small, as part of the revolution, each little step, each little act has to be driven and has to be guided by our politics, has to be built on the foundation of our political basis for being here and of our political kind of shared visions for a freer Myanmar. At least to me, some of the most important syntheses that we've reached with our comrades here have been not through some political meeting where we hash out our points of agreement or solidarity or something. We don't do those, or at least I haven't done any. But they arise through real direct fundamental questions that we face every day. Whether it's actual contradictions that arise in the struggle that we need to work through, or simply the daily acts of working alongside one another, doing our laundry together in camp with our comrades here, or whatever we might be doing. All of these daily acts are each opportunities for us to, in small ways, build these bonds of solidarity and also build the methods of solidarity by which we struggle together. Whether we're on the front line or whether we are in the daily life, all of our acts, all of our works together with our comrades here are built on these political foundations, and through these kind of smaller daily ways of joining in shared struggle with one another, this is how we build shared understanding of a political vision of what a free Chin Hills and what a free Myanmar can look like.
In your section on love, you really beautifully emphasize camaraderie as a foundation for love, especially in a revolutionary context. I'm curious what building that foundation looks like for you.
Yeah, I like this question a lot. For me, there are two situations in which I find myself most significantly building camaraderie. Or at least, actually, I will go back a little bit. Not even two situations, two ways in which we build camaraderie. The first is through shared experience and shared demonstration of revolutionary commitment to one another. This can, as I spoke to before, look like getting exploded together, or successfully defeating the enemy together, or in some cases, taking losses together, sharing martyrs, having shared experiences of our revolutionary comrades who we love and will continue to love, but who are no longer with us, at least in physical form, who gave themselves to the revolution in perhaps the most complete way that one can. This shared experience of martyrs that we know is a very direct and clear way that we build these bonds of camaraderie. In the same way that shared experiences directly with one another on front lines build camaraderie. At the same time, the other way in which we build camaraderie is not just through shared experience, it's through choice. Camaraderie, to me, has to be fundamentally built on a choice of commitment. When I look to any comrade that I fight alongside in this revolution, that comrade represents to me an active choice to elevate the kind of revolutionary bond that we hold and the revolutionary commitment to one another that we hold as, at least in my case, quite fundamentally the highest form of relationship that can exist between any two people, or especially any group of people. And I think that this active choice of commitment based on shared revolutionary belief in victory is the foundation on which all relationships can be built more strongly than is possible in any situation where that doesn't exist. Yeah, today I believe quite strongly that this choice of commitment to our comrades, choice of commitment to one another, and ultimately commitment that is based in our commitment to our shared revolutionary goals, is the foundation on which all of our revolutionary relationships can be built more strongly and more significantly, and also is the foundation on which the revolution rests. If we don't have these bonds of solidarity, and especially if these bonds are not bonds of commitment to one another and to the projects that we share, then without those bonds and that commitment, there is no foundation on which to build a revolution. And so, at least in my perspective, these intentional bonds of shared revolutionary struggle and of commitment to our comrades are perhaps the most important thing that I have learned in this fight.
I feel like the commitment part is really fascinating to me, and maybe I've been struggling with it a lot this year, oscillating between doing work with people, and sometimes I feel like there's a dichotomy, or I don't know, like a binary between commitment to the cause or the struggle or the liberatory movement versus the commitment to each other. And I don't necessarily think they need to be in conflict with each other, but find that that's something that comes up for me again and again. Like it feels like that's something that's present. And I wonder how much of that is how much time people spend being enmeshed with capitalism and these colonial processes versus where people are sharing like space all the time and they're committed to this on a deeper level. So it's not just this is my personal life versus my revolutionary life versus something else. But do you feel like that's something that being there and doing this kind of work allows you to kind of pass like like the part of it where it's like the commitment is just to the struggle in the hours that people engage with it as opposed to like their normal life? There's something there that I think I've been trying to reach towards. So I wonder what you make of that.
We can safely say that in the West, this is perhaps the greatest challenge faced by the left. This idea of commitment to the struggle or commitment to one another, or where do those meet? Where are they separate? And especially simply the base level of commitment in either of those cases were, for me, before I came here, perhaps the thing that was most significantly missing in all struggle. In the West, we have a tendency, especially at the moment, towards a culture of distrust, both in one another and in anything that we build. We have this constant nagging feeling in the back of our head that whatever we're building will either betray us or that we will need to betray it because something will be so fundamentally wrong with it that we weren't able to prevent, that it will have to be cast aside. This applies both to our projects and to our comrades when we talk about organizing in a Western context. One of the most important things that I learned here is how to make this revolutionary commitment to one another the foundation on which all other relationships are built. And so, to me, in revolution, it doesn't matter if I like you, it doesn't matter if I think you're funny, it doesn't matter if I think you are the most annoying person in the world. If you are my comrade, I am as committed to you as I am to any other comrade. Now, of course, we're like human beings. We form social bonds, and these social bonds are beautiful and important and critical. But these social bonds cannot be the basis of how we decide who we commit to and who we don't, and which parts of revolutionary struggle we commit to and which we don't. They especially cannot be the basis on which we decide whether a comrade is worth maintaining commitment to. And so if we instead can roll back a little bit, step back, build our foundations of the active choice of commitment to one another and to the struggle as being one and the same, not separable in any way. Like, the struggle is our comrades and our comrades are the struggle. Building that foundation, building that basis of commitment, and then basing our social relationships on top of that, rather than the other way around. I think that, at least for me, this has been the lesson and the development internally that has most shaped my time in Myanmar and been most shaped by my time in Myanmar. I've just learned a different way of committing to people and to revolution than I thought existed before I came here. And of course, I think that this, not being absent, but at least being deprioritized and devalued in Western struggle, is not unintentional. This is the result of decades of very intentional counterinsurgency work by the nation states in which our struggle is waged. The most dangerous thing to any nation state is a revolutionary movement that cannot be split apart with infighting, that cannot be split apart with social fracturing. If we make active decisions that the struggle is the most important thing, and that therefore our comrades are the most important thing because they're one and the same, and we make that an active choice rather than just based in how we feel about someone, then we can build much more durable and much more profound struggle than is possible when our basis is still in this kind of capitalist and individualist influenced idea of more unintentional personal relationship.
How grief is addressed, whether in the front lines or in the rear base at camp, and how does that address, how does that impact the martyr culture, or the martyr culture impact how we think of grief, either past grief or future grief that the struggle is certain of?
No matter how much we try to elevate martyrs and elevate the importance of those who have given their lives to the struggle, grief is, of course, an inherent part of any revolutionary struggle, especially any struggle at such a kind of high level of armed militancy as this one. We in the AIF, of course, had our martyrs, Obed and Mungboy, in Phalam battle. Ultimately, without those martyrs and without their sacrifice, I don't know that we would have won that battle. I don't know that the town of Phalam would be free now. They, of course, also were just two among dozens of martyrs who gave their lives to free that town, gave their lives on that exposed and terrifying mountaintop, who made that sacrifice for the revolution so that their comrades and so that their families and so that their loved ones could know freedom in a way that up until then had been impossible. That grief is unavoidable, and that grief should not be avoided. The loss of a comrade is a deep and personal and fundamental aspect of the way we experience revolutionary struggle that, most importantly, has to be collective. What we find here is that whether we are talking about the aspects of martyrdom, the aspects of losing a comrade to the struggle, that we view as like elevating martyrdom very intentionally, or the aspects of grief, in either case, if it's not done collectively, then it doesn't bring us to a heightened level of the revolution, the way that it can when we experience these things collectively. Obed and Mungboy, for example, I knew both of them, and at the same time, by far the most important ways that they are remembered are the ways that we remember them collectively. Whether it's us as the AIF, whether it's other comrades of theirs in other revolutionary armies, whether it's their families. The way that we experience and talk about and keep them alive collectively are the ways in which they continue to bring us meaning. These are the ways in which martyrs don't really die in the struggle. I'm actually looking right now, I can look up here at a portrait of Obed. the example of these martyrs is the path that we all actively are choosing to follow every day. And so these active ways in which we collectively bring intention to both how we feel about, how we experience, and how we remember our martyrs are, at least for me, the most important ways that we work through the grief that, of course, comes along with martyrdom. We can say this is also not universally the position. In many parts of this revolution, the approach to martyrdom is much more one of loss and one of mourning, one of a deeper grief that is not directed into this raising up of the martyr and this keeping alive of the martyr. And we can say that we also see this approach and this way of feeling the grief as really necessary and really important and really a part of the struggle here that needs to not only needs to happen, but needs to also be elevated as critical to the continued existence of those martyrs. Grief in this revolution takes a wide range of forms, whether within our own structures or in, of course, all of the different communities that we're part of here. Grief is also not only limited to the loss of individuals. One of the things that I grieve most strongly in this revolution is I look around and we're almost 5 years into this struggle now. There are a lot of my comrades in this revolution who never got to actually experience growing up in their own culture, uninterfered with by the violence of the dictatorship, in the way that they should have been able to, in the way that young people everywhere should always be able to. We can see this in the real daily pain that is experienced by some of our comrades. And we can also see it in cultural loss. We can see it in ways that some of our comrades are less connected, less directly connected with their actual immediate culture here than they would be had they been able to continue to grow up in their villages, in their families, in their communities, rather than having to flee to guerrilla camps in the mountains in order to avoid their families being airstriked. Of course, the airstrikes still come, but our comrades here make the commitment, make the decision to wage their struggle in places where when the airstrikes come, it won't be civilians, it won't be random members of their family being murdered by those airstrikes and by those drone bombs and by the rocket artillery. This, of course, doesn't stop the Tatmadaw from bombing the villages anyway, from sending their airstrikes, sending their artillery into the villages anyway. But this commitment that is made by our revolutionary comrades and this sacrifice that is made by joining the revolution and committing to the revolution until victory is both beautiful and something to be respected and something to be admired, and also brings with it loss for each comrade that we can grieve openly. And this, I think, is also a good way of understanding grief at more direct, loss of comrades and martyrdom in the revolution, is that we, of course, can grieve the loss of someone's sacrifice, and we can elevate that sacrifice and elevate their example as a way of keeping them alive. And some might view this as contradiction, but I think, in my perspective, it is the duality of it, the grief that recognizes the sacrifice and the respect of the sacrifice and the raising up of that sacrifice that elevates it. Those two things together are what ultimately make martyr culture.
When writing Lessons from the Hills, what audience do you have in mind? Who do you write for? And kind of what do you hope to accomplish with that piece and like the craft of it? Because like I was saying earlier, it's very well written. And then kind of side tangent question is, are there a lot of artists in the revolution? And how does that impact the culture there? I know music is big.
The audience that I was most significantly trying to reach when writing this is people with a mind towards revolution, people who want to see the bringing down of these structures of power that oppress us every day, and who are facing this like escalating wave of fascism and of climate crisis around the world, and who perhaps are not sure how to respond to the immediacy and the violence of these crises. Because that's where I was, I can say, before I came here. And I think that's where many of my comrades in the West are right now. And so, most importantly, I want this to be a piece that can be read as an example by those comrades of the fact that victory is possible. Not only is victory possible, this is something we say a lot. Not only that victory is possible, though, this is something we've been saying for a long time and that people say frequently, but that victory is imperative. Victory is required of us. And reaching a place of real certainty in that possibility of victory is necessary for every single one of us in order for that victory to be achieved. There's something we say very frequently in this revolution. It's something we say at the end of almost everything we do. It's Aung Yami, and it means we must win. Not we will win, not we're winning. We must win. Victory is required of us, and victory is our responsibility to ourselves, to our comrades, and to the revolution. So really the audience that I'm hoping to reach with that piece is whoever needs to hear that message right now. And to your second question about art and artists in the revolution, we can say it's everywhere. I can look, for example, to a very dear comrade who I've been working with lately, is an incredibly talented musician who specifically is working to not rediscover, but at least to repopularize and to re-explore some of the older, more traditional forms of music of his people that have in recent years been kind of not lost, but at least deprioritized and de-emphasized in the face of, obviously, Western cultural hegemony. Seeing some of, for example, the ways that he brings his music to revolutionary struggle is every single day inspiring to me. We, of course, in the AIF also like to play music a lot. I think people have probably seen some of my videos of Azad with his banjo. We have a great deal of musicality in this group. But I would say that it very notably pales in comparison to the musicality of this revolution. The things that get popular coming out of this revolution, especially in the West, are at times kind of mid, let's be real. Some of the things that get popular in the West coming out of this revolution musically are things that we could say are very Western inspired and very kind of like, I would say, inspired by every one of us has a white boy mumble rapper friend with a SoundCloud. And sometimes these are the influences of the music that actually becomes the most popular in the West coming out of this revolution. But we can also say that within the revolution itself, within these mountain camps and on the front lines, there's a real organic culture of revolutionary music and of shared musical expression and shared musical experience that is really beautiful and that I'm incredibly honored to get to be a part of.
Reading through it, it really reminded me a lot of the texts that really spoke to me when I was first getting radicalized, like this kind of inviting in. And then, I don't know, I just loved all the different scenes and moments, like the drinking coffee and talking about certain things being chopped down in the hills and that being like a way that the water gets fucked up. I feel like it reminded me of those earlier texts that inspired me, because when you were talking about grief, I kept thinking like one way that I define grief is loving something enough to name what's at stake or name precisely what has been lost. And I feel like really beautiful and emotionally engaging radical literature does that. And I feel like there are those beats throughout it that I found really enjoyable. Aside from all of that, is there a lesson that you didn't put in the text for any reason, or things that you feel like were left out? When I think of lessons, I'm like, oh, there had to be things that didn't make it through.
Yeah, of course, in any project like this that is focusing on lessons, it depends on the audience. It depends on who the project is for. There are, of course, lessons that I didn't include in this. There are lessons that I've experienced that I share with my comrades here that I think the zine that I'm putting out that's for a Western audience is not the place for them. There are some lessons that require a certain, not just level of revolutionary development, but a level of existing revolutionary commitment to really receive and to really take up. There are, of course, some lessons there are many lessons I've learned here that didn't make it into this text, and that process of removing some. It's been quite intentional.
Yeah, it was an absolute honor to have you on, and hopefully we will be able to again. Yeah, thank you so much. Any last thoughts you want to get out?
The best way to support is to support the revolution here, whether that's materially through finding all of the different ways that you can support the various revolutionary groups here, or whether it's supporting in more political sense, like making sure people actually know about and understand and recognize the real revolutionary struggle happening in Myanmar, because on the Western left, it's not talked about so much, especially nowadays. Also, as the AIF, we're always excited to see messages of solidarity. We're always excited to see people reaching out and extending their support. You also, of course, can support us materially. People can go to our media, our website. They can donate to us. We are always selling patches. People seem to like buying patches, and that's a great way you can support us, especially people who want to support on a recurring monthly basis. This is especially helpful for us. We have a lot of ongoing costs and expenses in this revolution. All of the support that we receive goes directly into revolutionary struggle. We can be found in various places. Of course, one of the most popular places people follow us is on Instagram, where we are AIF Myanmar. I can be found on there as Rachel Ramlen Moy. There's also Azad can be followed on there. I'm sure y'all can maybe put his handle in the show notes because I can't remember it off the top of my head. But most importantly, just I want to see people stay engaged with the revolution in Myanmar as international struggle and as part of this international fight against fascism, as one front line in that global fight against fascism in which we are all struggling. Whether that looks like supporting us or other revolutionary groups here, or just spreading the word and making political problems for those trying to further this dictatorship. All of this we like to see.
Hey everyone, we're excited to invite you to join us on Patreon. By supporting us, you'll be helping us keep the podcast going and make it possible for us to continue sharing Black radical ideas and history. On Patreon, you'll get exclusive access to reading episodes, where we break down important texts as well as early access to our guest interviews. Your support also helps us create more educational resources, like a website that will include educational modules about our episode topics and potential live streams. If you want to learn more and support the podcast, visit patreon.com/thedugoutpod. Every contribution makes a difference.